glasses sitting heavy on the vanity shelf. A fragile little monument I bought for myself. I used to wear the jasmine just to catch your attention. A desperate little plea for a beautiful connection. But the fragrance only lingered in an empty room, suffocating slowly in the center of the gloom. I traced the golden letters fading on the glass, watching all the seasons of our history pass. It used to be a signature, a sin of our design, but now it's just a memory that's no longer mine. I don't wanna carry the weight of the air. I don't want the ghost of you tangled in my hair. The atmosphere is clearing, the window is wide. I'm letting out the sorrow that I kept trapped inside. I'm washing off the wasted perfume, standing in the rain, letting every single drop completely numb the pain. Yeah, I'm trading in the bottle for a wide open field. The damage is done, but the spirit is completely healed. I don't need the artificial sweetness on my skin. I'm breathing in the freedom of exactly where I've been. Wasted perfume, blowing away in the beautiful wind. I pour the heavy liquid right into the porcelain sink, watching the illusion completely start to shrink. The water washes over the heavy floor of lies. I'm looking at the mirror with completely open eyes. You wanted me contained, a heavily curated set, but I'm a massive storm, a natural event. This whole city lights are completely shining bright. I'm walking out the door and stepping right into the night. The pavement is wet, the air is totally clean. I'm starring in the center of a brilliant movie scene. I don't wanna carry the weight of the air. I don't want the ghost of you tangled in my hair. The atmosphere is clearing, the window is wide. I'm letting out the sorrow that I kept trapped inside. I'm washing off the wasted perfume, standing in the rain, letting every single drop completely numb the pain. Yeah, I'm trading in the bottle for a wild open field. The damage is done, but the spirit is completely healed. I don't need the artificial sweetness on my skin. I'm breathing in the freedom of exactly where I've been. Wasted perfume, blowing away in the beautiful wind. Let the glass shatter, let the heavy sand disperse. I'm lifting up the anchor, I'm breaking the curse. I'm blooming from the ashes, rising from the floor. I don't wanna wear the heavy sadness anymore. I'm washing off the wasted perfume, standing in the rain, letting every single drop completely numb the pain. Yeah, I'm trading in the bottle for a wide open field. The damage is done, but the spirit is completely healed. The air is finally my own, breathing deep. Wasted perfume is gone, the fire is gone, but the sky is so bright. We lit the heavy fuse and watched the sky ignite. A beautiful explosion in the middle of the night. We burn incredibly fast, a brilliant shade of red, leaving all the heavy, complicated things unsaid. But gravity is cool, the sparks began to fall, leaving nothing but a shadow right upon the wall. I'm standing in the field, looking upward at the smoke, accepting the reality of the promise that we broke. The silence is immense, settling on the ground. I'm finding my own peace entirely in the lack of sound. The twilight is a canvas of purple and gold, a beautiful reminder that the story has been told. I'm not reaching for the ashes, trying to find a spark. I'm embracing the quiet that follows in the dark. These are tears in the afterglow, a deeply beautiful relief falling from my eyes as I finally find my peace. Yeah, the blinding light is over, the heavy show is done. I'm standing in the brilliance of the setting of the sun. I'm crying not in sorrow but in deeply profound relief. A massive beautiful shedding of the heavy toxic grief. Tears in the afterglow, watering the wildflowers on the ground. The city looks incredible from this highly quiet hill. The frantic heavy energy is completely standing still. I used to think the ending was a terrifying void, a massive empty space where the love was destroyed. But the sky is illuminating everything we left behind. A highly poetic closure to a deeply troubled mind. I let the salt water completely trace across my cheek. I'm finding the heavy strength that I used to think was weak. The temperature is dropping but my heart is totally warm. I'm walking incredibly safely, completely out of the storm. The twilight is a canvas of purple and gold, a beautiful reminder that the story has been told. I'm not reaching for the ashes, trying to find a spark. I'm embracing the quiet that follows in the dark. These are tears in the afterglow, a deeply beautiful relief falling from my eyes as I finally find my peace. Yeah, the blinding light is over, the heavy show is done. Standing in the brilliance of the setting of the sun. I'm crying not in sorrow but in deeply profound relief. A massive beautiful shedding of the heavy toxic grief. Tears in the afterglow, watering the wildflowers on the ground. From the burn comes the beauty, from the ash comes the seed. I'm entirely discovering exactly what I need. The colors in the sky are entirely shifting to the blue. I'm completely, entirely, beautifully over you. Let it glow, a beautiful end in the afterglow, a beautiful end, a beautiful end. These are tears in the afterglow, a deeply beautiful release falling from my eyes as I finally find my peace. Yeah, the blinding light is over, the heavy show is done. I'm standing in the brilliance of the setting of the sun. The sky is clearing up, the afterglow is fading into stars. I'm finally free. Let the glass fall. We built a castle out of crystal, reaching for the clouds. Standing high above the city, hiding from the crowds. The light would hit the surface, painting rainbows on the wall. A beautifully constructed dream that was destined to fall. I walked around the fragile halls, afraid to make a sound, terrified to feel the heavy tremors in the ground. But the foundation was a fiction, a beautiful deceit, and the reality was cracking right beneath my feet. I look up at the ceiling as the first fracture appears, a sudden rushing waterfall of all my hidden fears. I don't wanna live inside a prison anymore. I'm stepping past the fragments lying on the marble floor. The sky is looking endless now, the barrier is gone. I'm waking up completely in the middle of the dawn. The shining splinters off the shoulder of my car, a melody of freedom rising up inside my throat. You wanted me protected in a heavily curated space, but I belong entirely to the wild open grace. The city lights are glowing through the ruins of the dome. I'm finally realizing that my spirit is my home. I watch the heavy towers collapse into the dirt, a massive, beautiful release of all the heavy hurt. I don't wanna live inside a prison anymore. I'm stepping past the fragments lying on the marble floor. The sky is looking endless now, the barrier is gone. I'm waking up completely in the middle of the dawn. I'm walking through the shattered illusions, stepping in the light. The heavy walls are coming down incredibly bright. Yeah, the fantasy is over, the masterpiece is broken, but the heavy, honest truth has finally been spoken. I'm breathing in the open air, the wind is running wild. I'm standing in the wreckage, completely reconciled. Shattered illusions, reflecting the beautiful truth. From the broken pieces, a completely brand new start. I'm planting a wild garden in the center of my heart. Let the heavy rains come down, let the wildflowers grow. I'm letting the beautiful, messy reality flow. Watch it fall. I'm stepping out. I'm walking through the shadows, stepping in the light. The heavy walls are coming down incredibly bright. Yeah, the fantasy is over, the masterpiece is broken, but the heavy, honest truth is finally been spoken. The open sky, no more ceiling, shattered and the city is breathing with me. The traffic lights are blinking yellow down the empty street. The rhythm of the silence is the only kind of beat. I'm standing on the balcony, the world is told this heavy hour. The space you left behind, a massive echoing cavern in the center of my mind. I'd fill it up with memories, scrolling through the past, desperate for a fleeting comfort that would never last. But tonight the breeze is gentle, sweeping through the trees. I'm finding my own strength, completely off my knees. The solitude is blooming like a flower in the concrete. A heavy, quiet victory, a beautiful defeat. I'm not reaching for the phone, I'm reaching for the stars. I'm making peace with all my beautifully heavy scars. I'm finding my own rhythm in the lonely hour, standing in the darkness like a wild heavy flower. Yeah, the noise is completely gone, the heavy crowd is clear. I'm finally discovering the magic I have here. I'm wrapping up the quiet like a heavy velvet shawl. I'm no longer terrified of the inevitable fall. The lonely hour is exactly where I find myself. The skyline is a silhouette against the purple night. I'm watching all the shadows turning beautifully bright. You told me I would wither if I had to stand alone, but my roots are growing deeper right into the heavy stone. I pour a cup of water, watching the ripples softly sway. A deeply peaceful ritual to wash the heavy pain away. The panic has subsided, the heavy storm is done. I'm standing in the quiet, waiting for the morning sun. The solitude is blooming like a flower in the concrete. A heavy, quiet victory, a beautiful defeat. I'm not reaching for the phone, I'm reaching for the stars. I'm making peace with all my beautifully heavy scars. I'm finding my own rhythm in the lonely hour, standing in the darkness like a wild heavy flower. Yeah, the noise is completely gone, the heavy crowd is clear. I'm finally discovering the magic I have here. I'm wrapping up the quiet like a heavy velvet shawl. I'm no longer terrified of the inevitable fall. The lonely hour is exactly where I find myself. Let the heavy moon shine down, let the quiet completely stay. I'm entirely grateful that you finally walked away. The independence is a melody, sweet and incredibly pure. I finally found the medicine, I finally found the I'm standing tall, embrace the quiet. I'm finding my own rhythm in the lonely hour, standing in the darkness like a wild heavy flower. Yeah, the noise is completely gone, the heavy crowd is clear. I'm finally discovering the magic I have here. Just the night breeze and a peaceful heart. The lonely hour. Let it blow away. I felt a sudden shiver walking down the avenue, a phantom heavy pressure that reminded me of you. A hand upon my shoulder that was never really there. A sudden heavy perfume hanging in the autumn air. I turned around expecting to see a shadow in the sun. The street was totally empty, the haunting had begun. It's just a heavy residue of everything we used to be. A microscopic tragedy washing right over me. But I'm not running backward to catch a heavy ghost. I'm leaving the illusion, tied right to the heavy pose. Oh, it's just an echo in the wind, a trick of the heavy light, a residual emotion fading out into the night. I'm exhaling the memory, letting the vapor rise. I'm wiping away the illusion from my heavy, tired eyes. It's just a ghost of a feeling, a shadow on the wall. I'm absolutely refusing to answer the heavy call. Yeah, the spirit is transparent, the heavy chain is broke. I'm walking completely right through the heavy toxic smoke. I'm letting the wind completely carry the history away. I'm stepping into the brilliance of a totally brand new day. Ghost of a feeling, I'm exercising the pain. I used to hold a seance for the heavy love we lost. We'll pay the incredibly steep and heavy cost. I light the heavy candles, begging for a sign, desperate to believe that the heavy love was mine. But holding on to phantoms only makes your heavy hands bleed. I'm finally recognizing exactly what my spirit needs. The haunting is officially over, the heavy house is clean. I'm standing in the absolute center of a scene. It's just an echo in the wind, a trick of the heavy light, a residual emotion fading out into the night. I'm exhaling the memory, letting the vapor rise. I'm wiping away the illusion from my heavy, tired eye. Yeah, it's just a ghost of a train, a shadow on the wall, shadow on the wall. I'm absolutely refusing to answer the heavy call. Yeah, the spirit is transparent, the heavy chain is broke. I'm walking completely right through the heavy toxic smoke. I'm letting the wind completely carry the history away. I'm stepping into the brilliance of a totally brand new day. Ghost of a feeling. No more looking over my shoulder, no more heavy dread. I'm a victim, the heavy specter that was living in my head. The heavy air is clearing up, the sunlight is so pure. I'm opening up the heavy window, unlocking the heavy door. Let the wind take it, I'm entirely free. It's just a ghost of a feeling, a shadow on the wall, a shadow on the wall. Absolutely refusing to answer the heavy call, to answer the heavy call. Yeah, the spirit is transparent, the heavy chain is broke. I'm walking completely right through the heavy toxic smoke. Just a breeze now, nothing holding me back. Ghost of a feeling. So sweet, but it burns on the way down. We dressed our heavy tragedy in designer clothes, hiding all the heavy thorns right beneath the rose. We sat in the VIP overlooking the heavy crowd, speaking our toxic vows incredibly softly, incredibly loud. The bubbles in the glass were a highly beautiful disguise, distracting from the heavy sorrow entirely in your eyes. We drank the heavy vintage, celebrating the heavy decay, smiling for the heavy cameras, looking completely away. But the sugar is entirely fading, the heavy taste is flat. I'm totally walking completely right away from that. It's a heavy toxic luxury, a beautiful heavy cage. We're staring into entirely in a tragedy. Upon a heavy stage, I'm setting down the crystal, wiping the heavy pain. I'm stepping entirely away from the cinematic scene. I'm completely done with the champagne and sorrow. I'm walking into the light of a beautifully wild tomorrow. Yeah, the glamour was a heavy bandage for a bleeding heart. I'm ripping off the heavy fabric, tearing it apart. I don't need the heavy intoxication to entirely make me blind. I'm leaving the beautiful, tragic, heavy luxury behind. Champagne and sorrow. I'm drinking the pure rain now. I walk out of the heavy venue into the pouring rain, washing off the heavy sequins, washing off the heavy stain. The water is incredibly freezing, but it feels so incredibly real. I'm entirely finally allowing my heavy soul to feel. You can keep the heavy bottle, keep the velvet rope. I'm trading in the heavy illusion for a wild open hope. The heavy streetlights reflect entirely on the wet concrete. I'm finding a deeply heavy victory in this sweet defeat. Heavy toxic luxury, a beautiful heavy cage, restoring entirely in a tragedy. Upon a heavy stage, I'm setting down the crystal, wiping the heavy pain. I'm stepping entirely away from the cinematic scene. I'm completely done with the champagne and sorrow. I'm walking into the light of a beautifully wild tomorrow. Yeah, the glamour was a heavy bandage for a bleeding heart. I'm ripping off the heavy fabric, tearing it apart. I don't need the heavy intoxication to entirely make me blind. I'm leaving the beautiful, tragic, heavy luxury behind. Champagne and sorrow. Oh, I'm drinking the pure rain now. Let the heavy storm wash away the highly toxic gold. I'm completely stepping out of the heavily broken mold. The nature is my sanctuary, the sky is my heavy roof. I'm entirely discovering the beautifully heavy truth. Wash it all away, let it pour. I'm completely done with the champagne and sorrow. I'm walking into the light of a beautifully wild tomorrow. Yeah, the glamour was a heavy bandage for a bleeding heart. I'm ripping off the heavy fabric, tearing it apart. Just a heavy rain, washing me completely clean. Champagne and You wrote the story, but I'm changing the ending. Use my heavy tears as ink for your heavy pen, drafting up the same old heavy tragedy again. I was the heavy inspiration for your highly toxic art, a heavily curated, beautifully broken heart. You love to play me fragile, looking at the heavy rain, capitalizing entirely on my deeply heavy pain. I sat in the heavy corner, posing for the heavy frame, believing I was entirely the one who took the blame. But I looked at the heavy pages you entirely wrote for me and realized I have the heavy power to entirely be free. I'm not your heavy tragic heroine, I'm not your fragile flower. I'm entirely taking back the deeply heavy narrative power. The ink is completely spilling, the heavy paper is torn. I'm entirely watching a totally brand new chapter born. I'm ripping up the diary of a broken muse. I'm entirely walking in my totally brand new shoes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You wrote me as the heavy victim in your heavy play, but I'm entirely directing the heavy scene today. I'm throwing the heavy pages directly into the fire. I'm rising completely above the deeply heavy wire. Diary of a broken muse. I'm rising. entirely writing a story that has never been told. A deeply heavy journey of a flower breaking through the stone. A beautiful heavy victory of standing entirely alone. You try to completely heavily edit the deeply heavy lines, but I'm entirely completely ignoring your toxic signs. The heavy book is entirely mine to completely heavily write. I'm completely steering the heavy ship entirely into the light. I'm not your heavy tragic heroine, I'm not your fragile flower. I'm entirely taking back the deeply heavy narrative power. The ink is completely spilling, the heavy paper is torn. I'm entirely watching a totally brand new chapter born. Hey, yeah. I'm ripping up the diary of a broken muse. I'm entirely walking in my totally brand new shoes. Yeah, you wrote me as a heavy victim in your heavy play, but I'm entirely directing the heavy scene today. I'm throwing the heavy pages directly into the fire. I'm rising completely above the deeply heavy wire. Diary of a blooming no more entirely deeply heavy, tragic, heavy prose. I'm entirely blooming beautifully, just like a wild rose. The authorship is entirely, totally, completely mine. I'm completely crossing out the deeply heavy, toxic line. I'm the author now. Watch the pages burn. I'm entirely diary of a broken muse. I'm entirely walking in my total mental shoes. Yeah, you wrote me as a heavy victim in your heavy play, but I'm entirely directing the heavy scene today. The heavy fire is warm. The pages are entirely etched. Diary of a broken muse. Just me and the stars, finally telling the truth. I took a heavy drive entirely out of the city pound, escaping the entirely heavily, highly toxic sound. I parked the heavy car entirely on the heavy canyon edge, standing entirely alone, completely on the heavy ledge. The heavily, completely entire sky is totally filled with light. I'm completely and entirely breathing the deeply heavy night. I kept the heavy secrets entirely locked inside my chest. A heavily, deeply, completely toxic, heavy kind of test. But the heavy universe is entirely listening to me now. I'm entirely ready to make the deeply heavy honest vow. The silence is entirely a deeply heavy open ear. I'm entirely, completely shedding the deeply heavy fear. I'm speaking the completely, entirely heavy honest truth. Releasing the entirely, completely, deeply wasted youth. These are my midnight confessions to the open sky. I'm entirely letting the heavy toxic history die. I'm screaming the heavy pain entirely into the dark, watching it entirely ignite into a beautiful spark. Don't need entirely deeply heavy priest or a heavy shrine. I'm entirely finding a deeply beautiful peace that is mine. Midnight confessions. The heavy soul is complete breathing. I admit that I entirely stayed way too completely long, ignoring the entirely, completely, deeply heavy wrong. I admit that I entirely, deeply compromised my heavy heart, playing a completely, entirely, highly, deeply toxic part. But the heavy guilt is entirely lifting off my heavy spine. I'm completely, entirely, deeply here. We doing entirely fine. The heavy constellations are entirely guiding my heavy way. I'm entirely, completely waiting for the deeply heavy day. Silence is entirely a deeply heavy open ear. I'm entirely, completely shedding the deeply heavy fear. I'm speaking the the completely, entirely heavy, honest truth. Releasing the entirely, completely, deeply wasted youth. These are my midnight confessions to the open sky. I'm entirely letting the heavily toxic history die. Yeah, I'm screaming the heavy pain entirely into the dark, watching it entirely ignite into a beautiful spark. I don't need entirely a deeply heavy priest or a heavy shrine. I'm entirely finding a deeply beautiful peace that is mine. Midnight confessions. The heavy soul is completely breathing. The heavy words are entirely floating up into the space. I'm entirely, completely finding my hella deeply happy place. The entirely heavy burden is completely, entirely gone. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, entirely moving on. I'm entirely free. Let it completely go. These are my midnight confessions to the open sky. I'm entirely letting the heavily toxic history die. Yeah, I'm screaming the heavy pain entirely into the dark, watching it entirely ignite into a beautiful spark. The heavy sky is completely clear. The confession is entirely heard. Midnight confessions. Some endings don't need words, they just need space. I didn't leave a heavy note completely on the kitchen table. I didn't entirely heavily craft a deeply toxic fable. I just packed the heavy bags while you were completely asleep. A deeply, heavily, entirely quiet promise I had to keep. The heavy argument was entirely, completely exhausting my mind. I'm entirely leaving the deeply, heavily toxic words behind. The heavy closure doesn't always come with the heavy speech. Sometimes it's entirely stepping completely out of the reach. I close the heavy door entirely without a single sound. I'm entirely planting my heavy feet completely on the ground. The deeply heavy silence is the loudest heavy thing I've said. All entirely heavily, completely, deeply heavy threat. I'm not waiting entirely for a deeply heavy final fight. I'm completely, entirely stepping directly into the light. These are the heavily, deeply, entirely, completely walking the heavily, deeply, entirely, completely heavy roots are growing deep. I'm entirely, completely, entirely waking from the sleep. Unspoken goodbyes. This beautiful, quiet bloom. You'll wake up to the entirely, completely heavy, empty space and completely, entirely, heavily realize I'm out of the race. You'll entirely, heavily, completely search for a deeply heavy clue. But the entirely, heavily, completely only heavy answer is you. I'm entirely, heavily, deeply driving down a completely open road. Entirely, completely, heavily, entirely low. The heavy morning sun is entirely hitting my heavy face. I'm entirely, completely, heavily finding a deeply happy place. The deeply heavy silence is the heavy final fight. I'm completely entirely stepping directly into the lobbies. All that nothing deeply, entirely, completely. Walking the heavily, deeply, entirely, completely. Heavy roots are growing. I'm entirely, completely, entirely waking from the sleep. Unspoken goodbyes. A beautiful, quiet bloom. Oh no, more entirely, heavily, deeply, heavy, shouting matches in the dark. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, deeply finding my own spark. The heavily, entirely, completely, deeply quiet is a beautiful release. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely finding my own peace. The quiet is beautiful. I'm completely inside. I'm completely, entirely, deeply, completely. Unspoken goodbyes, no more completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, toxic lies. Yeah, I'm letting the deeply, heavy, quiet do the heavy talking. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, entirely, completely walking. Just the entirely open road. The silent, beautiful ending. Unspoken goodbyes. Look closely. See the survivor. I used to stand completely, entirely in the heavy bathroom light, analyzing every single deeply heavy, toxic fight. I look completely, entirely, heavily, directly at my heavy face, and entirely, completely, heavily hate the entirely heavy space. I saw the heavily, completely, deeply heavy regrets in my heavy eyes. The completely, entirely, deeply heavy, entirely toxic compromises. I was a heavy ghost of the entirely, completely heavy girl I was. Trapped entirely, completely, deeply inside the heavy claws. But today I entirely, completely, heavily wipe the heavy mirror clean. I'm completely, entirely, heavily taking back the heavy scene. The entirely, heavily, completely heavy glass is showing me the truth. I'm entirely, completely, heavily reclaiming my heavily wasted youth. I'm entirely, completely, heavily forgiving the heavily broken parts. I'm entirely, completely, heavily healing the deeply heavy hearts. I'm entirely, completely shattering the mirrors and regrets. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely placing my own bets. Yeah, the heavily, entirely, completely, deeply heavy past is entirely done. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, heavily, entirely walking in the sun. I see a deeply, heavily, completely, entirely beautiful wildflower. I'm completely, entirely, heavily taking back the heavy power, mirrors and regrets. I'm entirely, completely loving what I see. I entirely, completely, heavily trace the heavy lines upon my heavy cheek. They entirely, completely, heavily prove that I am not completely weak. Every single completely, entirely, deeply, heavy tear I heavily cry. Oh, is entirely, completely, heavily, entirely a totally heavy guy. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely, totally stepping entirely out. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, entirely clearing the heavy doubt. The entirely, heavily, completely, deeply heavy reflection is so clear. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, completely shedding the heavy fear. The entirely, heavily, completely heavy glass is showing me the truth. I'm entirely, completely, heavily reclaiming my heavily wasted youth. I'm entirely, completely, heavily forgiving the heavily broken parts. I'm entirely, completely, heavily healing the deeply heavy heart. I'm entirely, completely shattering the mirrors and regrets. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely placing my own bets. Yeah, the heavily, entirely, completely, deeply heavy past is entirely done. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, heavily, entirely walking in the sun. I see a deeply, heavily, completely, entirely beautiful wildflower. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, taking back the heavy power, mirrors and regrets. I'm entirely, completely loving what I see. No more entirely, completely, heavily, deeply heavy, toxic shame. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, completely, entirely changing the game. The entirely, completely, heavily, deeply heavy mirror is my heavy friend. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely writing a brand new end. I love the reflection. I'm completely, entirely free. I'm entirely, completely shattering the mirrors and regrets. I'm entirely, completely, heavily, entirely placing my own bets. Yeah, the heavily, entirely, completely, deeply heavy past is entirely done. I'm completely, entirely, heavily, entirely walking in the sun. The heavy glass is completely clear. The survivor is entirely beautiful. Mirrors and regrets. Singing me to sleep with poison. You hummed a melody that sounded just like safety, tracing circles on my skin so very softly. I closed my tired eyes and let the rhythm take me down, ignoring how the rising water made me start to drown. You whispered promises that melted on my heavy tongue, a beautiful deception sung to me when we were young. I knew the words were hollow, knew the notes were out of key, but I was so addicted to the way you looked at me. The harmony was beautiful, the undertone was cool. I played the willing victim, I played the quiet fool. I let the music wrap around my deeply broken mind, leaving all the terrifying warning signs behind. I'm suffocating slowly in these toxic lullabies, falling for the comfort of you beautifully disguised. Like you rock me in the cradle of a deeply shattered dream, tearing on my sanity completely at the seam. I hate the way your voice can make the heavy darkness fade while pulling me toxic lullabies, falling for the comfort of your beautifully disguised. Yeah, you rock me in the cradle of a deeply shattered dream, tearing all my sanity completely at the seam. I hate the way your voice can make the heavy darkness fade, while pulling me much deeper in the trap that you made. Toxic lullaby, I'm begging for the music to stop. I cover up my ears, I'm trying to forget the sound. I'm crawling through the quiet, trying to reach the solid ground. The lullaby is ending, the final note is dropping low. I'm letting all the dangerous and heavy magic go. Suffocating slowly in these toxic lullabies, falling for the comfort of your beautiful disguise. Yeah, you rock me in the cradle of a deeply shattered dream, tearing all my sanity completely at the seam. The song is over, the silence hurts but it's real. Toxic lullabies. Drifting away in a heavy sun. I revolved around your moves until the days were fully done. I tied my entire existence to the pulling of your tide. Nowhere to escape to, nowhere left to safely hide. But the atmosphere grew colder, the distance started to grow. The magnetic field is dying and the spinning is so slow. I'm slipping past the boundary, the tether finally snapped. I'm floating in the quiet where I used to be entrapped. I reach my hand out, trying to catch a heavy beam of light, but the darkness is expanding, swallowing my line of sight. The oxygen is thinning, the heavy pressure drops away. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to say. I'm falling out of orbit, drifting into empty space, losing the reflection of the light upon your face. Yeah, the gravity is broken, the heavy connection is lost. I'm floating in the wreckage, calculating all the costs. It's terrifyingly quiet, a beautiful tragic view. A million heavy miles from the center, that was you. Falling out of orbit, and I don't know how to your planet shrinking, turn into a tiny dot, a microscopic memory of the heavy love we got. I wonder if you notice that the sky is missing me, or if you're just enjoying the heavy space completely free. The constellations blur, the heavy tears begin to freeze. I'm traveling through the vacuum, moving like a quiet breeze. There is no heavy friction, there is no heavy sound, just a broken satellite that has forgotten how to bound. I reach my hand out, trying to catch a heavy beam of light, but the darkness is expanding, swallowing my line of sight. The oxygen is thinning, the heavy pressure drops away. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to say. I'm falling out of orbit, drifting into empty space, losing the reflection of the light upon your face. Yeah, the gravity is broken, the heavy connection is lost. I'm floating in the wreckage, calculating all the costs. It's terrifyingly quiet, a beautiful tragic view. A million heavy miles from the center, that was you. Falling out of orbit, and I don't know how to end. No more spinning in circles, chasing after your design. I'm drifting in the dark until I find a brand new sign. The universe is endless, the sorrow is incredibly deep. I'm letting the heavy silence rock my tired soul to sleep. turning into smoke. I found the wooden shoebox hidden underneath the bed, filled with all the heavy, beautiful words you had said. I traced the cursive writing, the way you looped my name. A sudden heavy flashback to the middle of the flame. You wrote that I was permanent, a highly sacred vow, but reading it is feeling like a cruel and heavy joke right now. The paper is turning yellow, the edge is starting to fray, just like the heavy promises you let entirely slip away. I strike the heavy match against the side of the tiny box. I'm breaking all the seals and locking all the heavy locks. The orange glow illuminates the heavy tear upon my cheek. I'm destroying the history that makes my heavy spirit weak. I'm staring at the burned letters curling in the quiet heat, watching the absolute destruction of a beautiful deceit. Yeah, the words are turning black, the heavy paper turns to ash. A heavy quiet funeral for a deeply tragic crash. I thought preserving memories would somehow keep you close to me, but I'm burning the illusion so I can finally be free. Burn letters, the smoke is stinging in my eyes. I watch a paragraph of I love yous dissolve into the air. I'm letting go of everything I used to deeply care. It feels like a betrayal to set the heavy words alight, but keeping them was keeping me a prisoner in the night. The handwriting is vanishing, the deeply heavy ink is gone. I'm sitting by the fireplace, waiting for the heavy dawn. The final scrap of paper reads forever and a day. I watch the heavy embers slowly carry it away. I strike the heavy match against the side of the tiny box. I'm breaking all the seals, unlocking all the heavy locks. The orange glow illuminates the heavy tear upon my cheek. I'm destroying the history that makes my heavy spirit weak. I'm staring at the burned letters curling in the quiet heat, watching the absolute destruction of a beautiful deceit. Yeah, the words are turning black, the heavy paper turns to ash. A heavy quiet funeral for a deeply tragic crash. I thought preserving memories would somehow keep you close to me, but I'm burning the illusion so I can finally be free. Burn letters, the smoke is stinging in my eyes. The fire is dying down, the heavy box is totally bare. I'm running my heavy fingers through my deeply messy hair. The physical evidence of you is officially destroyed. I'm throwing the heavy sorrow directly into the void. I'm staring at the burned letters curling in the quiet heat, watching the absolute destruction of a beautiful deceit. Yeah, the words are turning black, the heavy paper turns to ash. A heavy quiet funeral for a deeply tragic crash. Just gray ash now, nothing left to read. Burnt letters. Look at the mess. It used to be beautiful. The velvet ropes are heavily tangled on the marble floor. The heavy golden hinges are broken on the heavy door. We used to host a beautiful, a highly cinematic love, a heavy kind of magic sent directly from above. But the heavy walls are cracking, the heavy paint is peeling off. The heavy air is dusty, making my heavy spirit cough. I'm walking through the wreckage of a highly curated dream, a devastating reality tearing at the heavy seam. We thought we were invincible. invincible, a classic kind of tale. But every heavy ship eventually must face the heavy gale. The elegance is shattered, the heavily toxic truth is bare. I'm standing in the ruins of the heavy love we used to share. This is a ruined romance, a deeply heavy tragedy, a beautiful disaster stretching out in front of me. Yeah, the heavy script was perfect, but the actors lost their way. We completely ruined the ending of the beautiful display. I'm mourning the potential, crying for the heavy ghost, the heavy, deeply painful thing I used to love the most. Ruined romance. The final curtain heavily falls. I found a heavy rose lying crushed upon the wooden stair. A deeply heavy metaphor for everything we didn't repair. A heavy chandelier is completely missing half its light. A heavy dim reflection of the highly toxic endless fight. You're standing in the doorway, highly heavy silhouette. A deeply painful portrait of the heaviest regret. We don't even speak a word, there is nothing left to say. We're standing in the heavy silence of a beautifully dark grave. A classic kind of tale. But every heavy ship eventually must face the heavy gale. The elegance is shattered, the heavily toxic truth is bare. I'm standing in the ruins of the heavy love we used to share. This is a ruined romance, a deeply heavy tragedy, a beautiful disaster stretching out in front of me. Yeah, the heavy script was perfect, but the actors lost their way. We completely ruined the ending of the beautiful display. Crying for the heavy ghost, the heavy, deeply painful thing I used to love the most. Ruined romance. The final curtain heavily falls. No more playing heavy pretend. No more sweeping up the glass. I'm letting the deeply heavy ruined memories completely pass out. The story is officially over. The heavy book is entirely shut. I'm dealing with the heavy bleeding of a deeply painful cut. The contrast is killing me. Red and gray. You left a bouquet on the heavy kitchen counter space. A dozen dark red poly sitting in a heavy vase. But right beside the petals is the heavily burnt out ring. The heavily toxic ending of a deeply beautiful thing. The flowers are blooming, the heavily sweet perfume is thick. But the memory of the heavy fire makes me incredibly sick. You try to cover up the deeply heavy damage with romance. A heavily desperate attempt to get a deeply heavy second chance. But the scent of the smoke is lingering inside the heavy room. A deeply heavy shadow hanging right behind the bloom. Can't buy back the heavy trust with petals and a bow. The heavily, deeply painful truth is something we both know. A swelling at the ocean roses, a deeply heavy divide. The beautiful heavy illusion and the heavy pain I hide. Yeah, the red is incredibly vibrant, but the gray is incredibly deep. A heavy, deeply toxic secret that I can no longer velvet petal, soft against my heavy skin. Deeply heavy minder of the heavy place we used to begin. But then I touched the heavy soul right beside the heavy glass. A deeply heavy reality that I can never heavily bypass. You're begging for forgiveness, crying heavy on your knees. But the heavy dying garden has a deeply heavy cold disease. The roses will heavily wither, dropping petals on the floor. But the heavy black ash will stain forevermore. But the scent of the smoke is lingering inside the heavy room. A deeply heavy shadow hanging right behind the bloom. You can't buy back the heavy trust with petals and a bow. The heavily, deeply painful truth is something we both know. I'm swelling at the ash and roses. A deeply heavy divide. The beautiful heavy illusion and the heavy pain I hide. Yeah, the red is incredibly vibrant, but the gray is incredibly deep. A heavy, deeply toxic secret that I can no longer keep. You think the heavy flowers erase the heavy fire made, but I'm looking at the heavy burns resting in the heavy shade. Ash and roses, a deeply heavy broken display. I throw the heavy bouquet directly into the heavy empty trash. I'm washing my heavy hands, scrubbing off the heavy ash. The deeply heavy contrast is a deeply heavy cruel design. I'm erasing the heavy intersection of your heavy heart and mind. It's freezing, and it's only October. I turn the heavy thermostat up as high as it will ever go. But the deeply heavy chill is coming from the heavy below. I'm wearing your heavy sweater wrapped inside a heavy quilt. But I'm freezing in the heavy house that we deeply heavily built. The right side of the mattress is a deeply heavy open plane. A totally deeply empty space that brings a heavy kind of pain. I trace the heavy outline where you used to heavily lay. The deeply heavy indentation hasn't totally faded away. The heavy blankets cannot substitute the heavy warmth I miss. The heavily, deeply freezing air is a deeply heavy cold kiss. I'm shivering in the darkness, staring at the empty wall, waiting for the heavily, deeply freezing heavy snow to fall. It feels like winter in my bed, an incredibly bitter freeze. A heavily, deeply quiet storm blowing a freezing breeze. Yeah, the temperature dropped the second you heavily walk away, turning the highly colored colorful room into a deeply heavy gray. I'm curling up in a heavy circle, trying to find some heavy heat, but I'm suffering a deeply heavy, totally freezing defeat. Winter in my bed, winter in my bed, and I can't throw out my heart. I deeply heavy close my eyes and try to heavily pretend that the deeply heavy coldness is a deeply heavy passing trend. I imagine your heavy arm wrapping around my heavy waist, but the deeply heavy illusion is entirely heavily erased. The heavy window rattles from the deeply heavy outside window, deeply heavy meant for all the heavy ways we send. The deeply heavy frost is climbing up the heavy window glass. I'm heavily, deeply waiting for the deeply heavy season to pass. Substitute the heavy warmth I miss. The heavily, deeply freezing air is a deeply heavy cold kiss. I'm shivering in the darkness, staring at the empty wall, waiting for the heavily, deeply freezing heavy snow to fall. It feels like winter in my bed, an incredibly bitter freeze. A heavily, deeply quiet storm blowing a freezing breeze. Yeah, the temperature dropped the second you heavily walked away, turning the highly colorful room into a deeply heavy gray. I'm curling up in a heavy circle, trying to find some heavy heat, but I'm suffering a deeply heavy, totally freezing defeat. Winter in my bed, winter in my bed, and I can't throw out my heart. No heavy cup of tea, no deeply heavy burning fire can replace the deeply heavy warmth of our heavy desire. I'm a deeply heavy statue, frozen in the heavy night, waiting for the heavily, deeply absent heavy morning light. Dropped the second you heavy walk away, turning the highly colorful room into a deeply heavy gray. Just ice, empty space. Winter in my bed. Still hear the door slam over and over. The heavy argument is officially completely over now. We deeply heavily took the highly toxic, deeply heavy final bow, but the heavily, deeply tragic accrued us in the heavy living room. We're keeping the deeply heavy showers completely inside the gloom. I walk into the heavy kitchen, I hear the heavy glass break, a deeply heavy phantom sound that makes my heavy spirit ache. I walk down the heavy hallway, I hear the deeply heavy cry, deeply heavy sound of our completely, deeply heavy goodbye. The house is a deeply heavy recording of the tragic heavy fight, a heavily, deeply looping audio playing in the heavy night. I plug my deeply heavy ears, but the heavy sound is in my mind, a deeply heavy toxic frequency I heavily left behind. I'm drowning in the echoes of the end, a deeply heavy sound. The heavily, deeply toxic words are completely bouncing all around. Yeah, the heavy fight is over, but the heavy volume is so high, a deeply heavy repetition of a heavy tragic lie. I'm standing in the heavy silence, but the silence is so loud. I'm trapped inside the heavily, deeply toxic floor. The heavily, deeply tragic playback is incredibly crystal clear. A heavily, deeply toxic soundtrack feeding on my heavy fear. I try to play some heavy music, try to deeply drown it out, but the heavily, deeply tragic song is entirely heavily about a deeply heavy toxic ending that we completely heavily designed. A deeply heavy resonance that makes me heavily lose my mind. The house is a deeply heavy recording of the tragic heavy fight. A heavily, deeply looping audio playing in the heavy night. I plug my deeply heavy ears, but the heavy sound is in my mind. A deeply heavy toxic frequency I heavily left behind. I'm drowning in the echoes of the end. A deeply heavy sound. The heavily, deeply toxic words are completely bouncing all around. Yeah, the heavy fight is over, but the heavy volume is so high. A deeply heavy repetition of a heavily tragic lie. I'm standing in the heavy silence, but the silence is so loud. I'm trapped inside the heavily, deeply toxic, heavy thundercloud. Echoes of the end, replaying in my broken head. I have to deeply pack my heavy boxes, have to leave the heavy space. I cannot heavily, deeply live inside this heavily haunted place. The deeply heavy sound waves are completely crashing on the shore. I cannot deeply, heavily listen to the heavy end anymore. I'm drowning in the echoes of the end. A deeply heavy sound. The heavy, deeply toxic words are completely bouncing all around. Yeah, the heavy fight is over, but the heavy volume is so high. Turn off a heavily tragic light, fading slowly, but still there. Echoes of the end. I swear I saw you, but my mind is playing tricks. I walked into the heavy coffee shop completely down the street. I saw your heavy jacket sitting in a deeply heavy cold corner seat. My heavy, deeply broken heart entirely skipped a heavy beat. I rushed completely entirely forward, deeply ready for the meet. But the person deeply heavily turned around, a deeply heavy stranger's face. A heavily, completely tragic, deeply heavy, highly empty space. The deeply heavy toxic desert is completely playing with my eyes. A deeply heavy, tragic, deeply heavy pupils guide. That heavily, deeply toxic thirst is making me completely blind. The heavily tragic, deeply heavy trick of the mind. I'm deeply entirely reaching for highly, deeply heavy goals. I'm completely, deeply heavy, heavily toxic, tragic, heavy bows. I'm completely exhausted from chasing mirages of you. A deeply, heavily tragic, completely heavy, totally false view. Yeah, I see your heavy silhouette in every deeply heavy crowd. My completely, deep, heavy, tragic, deeply broken heart cries out loud. But every deeply heavy time I reach completely entirely out to touch my heavily, deeply tragic, deeply heavy fingers grasp at absolutely much. Chasing mirages, dying of a deeply heavy thirst. I deeply, heavily check my phone. I see your deeply heavy name appear. A heavily, completely, deeply tragic, deeply heavy, highly toxic fear. But it's completely, entirely just a deeply heavy glitch upon the screen. A completely, deeply tragic, heavily toxic, deeply empty scene. I hear deep deeply heavy. Laugh completely, entirely down the empty hall. I heavily, deeply, entirely, completely, totally, deeply answer the call. But it's completely, entirely, deeply heavy. Static on the empty line. A completely, heavily, deeply, tragic, deeply heavy, highly toxic sign. The heavily, deeply toxic thirst is making me completely blind. A heavily, deep, tragic, deeply heavy trick of other mind. Time to be entirely reaching for a highly, deeply heavy ghost. A completely, deeply heavy, heavy, toxic, tragic, heavy pose. I'm completely exhausted from chasing mirages of you. A deeply, heavily tragic, completely heavy, totally false view. Yeah, I see a heavy silhouette in every deeply heavy crowd. A completely, deeply tragic, deeply broken heart cries out loud. But every deeply heavy time I reach completely, entirely out to touch my heavily, deeply tragic, deeply heavy fingers grasp at absolutely nothing. I have to deeply heavy, heavy close my deeply tired eyes. I have to entirely, completely, deeply, heavily accept the heavy lies. The deeply heavy talks oasis is completely, entirely, deeply fake. It's not real. You're not here. I'm completely exhausted from chasing mirages of you. Deeply, heavily tragic, completely heavy, totally false view. Yeah, I see your heavy silhouette in every deeply heavy crowd. A completely deep, heavy, tragic, deeply broken heart cries out loud. Just empty space. Just empty space. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow process. The first deeply heavy crack appeared entirely on a Tuesday night. A heavily, deeply toxic, completely heavy, entirely quiet fight. The deeply, heavily, completely tragic, heavy surface looked entirely fine. But a deeply, heavily, entirely microscopic, heavy fracture crossed the line. A second deeply heavy split entirely happened when you walked away. A deeply heavy, tragic, completely, deeply heavy, toxic day. I completely, entirely, deeply heavy smiled and said that I was totally alright. While my heavily, deeply, entirely tragic heart was breaking in the night. It's a completely, entirely, deeply heavy, incredibly slow decay. A heavily, entirely, deeply tragic, completely heavy, heavy fray. You don't deeply, heavily, entirely, completely, heavily hear the massive sound until the entirely, heavily, deeply heavy pieces hit the ground. This is the deeply heavy, entirely tragic, quiet art of breaking. A completely, entirely, deeply heavy, slowly painful waking. Yeah, the heavily, deeply, entirely, completely heavy heart doesn't shatter fast. Yeah, deeply, entirely, completely, heavily breaks until the deeply heavy very last. I'm entirely, completely heavy, losing a deeply heavy piece every single day. Watching the entirely, completely, deeply heavy love deeply chip away. The art of breaking, a completely, entirely, deeply beautiful tragedy. I entirely, completely, deeply heavy try to entirely deeply heavy, entirely, completely heavy. Floors covered in the glass. A completely, entirely, deeply heavy, entirely tragic, heavy past. I'm entirely, completely, deeply heavily, completely, entirely standing in the mess. Completely, entirely, deeply heavy, entirely heavy, toxic quiet art of breaking. A completely, entirely, deeply heavy, slowly painful waking. Yeah, the heavily, deeply, entirely, completely heavy heart doesn't shatter fast. Deeply, entirely, completely, heavily breaks until the deeply heavy, very last. It's just pieces now. The art is finished. The art of breaking. I don't feel anything. At least that's what I tell myself. I entirely, completely, heavily looked entirely at the heavy photo date. And entirely, completely, deeply, heavily felt the heavy feeling slip away. I deeply, entirely, deeply, heavy told my heavy friends I'm totally, completely fine. I heavily, completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, totally toxic design. I deeply, entirely, heavily walked entirely past your heavy favorite place. Without a completely, entirely, deeply, heavily single heavy tear upon my face. I completely, entirely, deeply, heavy built a heavy fortress of completely heavy ice. A deeply, entirely, completely, toxic, deeply, heavy sacrifice. I'm entirely, completely, deeply, heavily wearing a heavy mask. A completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, toxic task. I completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, completely tell entirely myself I do not care. While I'm completely, entirely, deeply, heavily gasping for heavy air. I'm completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, living in these numb delusions. A completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, toxic fusion. Yeah, entirely, completely, deeply, heavily, deeply, till my heavy heart is stone. While I'm completely, entirely, deeply, heavily, deeply, cry entirely all alone. The heavy, completely, entirely, deeply, heavy apathy is a completely heavy light. A completely, entirely, deeply, entirely tragic, heavy, deeply dry. Numb delusions. Ooh. The heavily, entirely, deeply, heavy pain is completely bleeding through. I completely, entirely, deeply, entirely deleted your heavy number from my phone. I completely, entirely, deeply, highly toxic tone. I completely, entirely, deeply, threw your heavy jacket in the deeply heavy trash. I completely, entirely, deeply, deeply tragic crash. But the completely, entirely, deeply, entirely numbness is entirely fading out. I completely, entirely, deeply, deeply toxic doubt. I completely, entirely, deeply, entirely feelings are completely rushing back. I completely, entirely, deeply, deeply toxic attack. I'm completely, entirely, deeply, heavily wearing a heavy mask. A completely, entirely, deeply, heavy, toxic test. I deeply, entirely, deeply tell entirely myself I do not care. While I'm completely, entirely, deeply, gasping for the heavy air.